D No Shokutaku 2は、M2 のですね、リアルタイムポリゴンの機能をかなり強く使っているので、1よりもかなりアクション性とかですね、が強くなったタイトルだと思います。かなりスピーディーに
Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric, a continuing series on the work of Kenji Eno, more importantly, the trilogy of D, Enemy 0, and D2, and you know full well I was never going to do a retrospective without talking about the 3DO M2 version of D2. This game was something that I was very excited for when it was previewed in magazines back in the day, and it remains one of the lost Kenji Eno works because to this point in time, we've never been able to find a playable build of the 3DO M2 version of D2, just some files. And I've spent probably the last 5-6 years actively searching for this, but what we're going to do today is pivot away from the retrospective just a bit and talk about the story of D2 on the 3DO M2, how it ties into the original D and slightly to the Dreamcast version, and just kind of talk about this lost game on a lost console. What you're watching right now is one of the cutscenes from a 3DO M2 demo in a magazine for 3DO. I had this professionally translated by a Japanese native speaker, upscaled in DaVinci Resolve, and basically years ago told the story of what was happening. Because D2 originally was supposed to be a direct sequel to the original D, which we've already talked about on the retrospective, the story basically is that Laura from the first game dies in a plane crash supposedly, and her unborn child is taken back in time to Vlad Tepes to raise as his own son because he was not having children and his wife died because of the sins of all of his sacrificing and murder in history. It's a very interesting tie-in from a historical standpoint, taking a real-world figure and what he did in the real world we live in and tying it back to a video game on the 3DO. And I will say this cutscene is absolutely atmospheric, and it really makes me want to know what the full version of D2 for the M2 would be like. The good thing is we do have some gameplay that was recorded back at the 3DO offices in the 90s and was sent to me from some of the developers. I got the captures from the real VHS tapes that they were on, which we're moving over to now. And if you can't tell already, thematically and content-wise, D2 on the M2 shares a lot of tie-ins to the original D on 3DO and every other console, and that is because, again, it was a direct storyline continuation between the two. We have a large medieval castle just like you would see in the original D, and if we take a look at some of the artwork and that diamond pattern on the floor, you can directly trace that to the original version with the exact same diamond pattern. Now, it's presumable and even possible that the castle you see in the M2 version of D2 is one and the same of the castle that you're transported to from the hospital in the original D. The architecture matches, a lot of the textures and patterns match as well, so this again may be in fact the same place that we're seeing in this M2 footage demo, and using period screenshots I'm able to show you guys a little bit brighter as to what that would look like. But this demo version existed at one point in time. Unfortunately, when it was at the 3DO offices, it was overwritten and does not exist anymore. I don't have really any evidence that there is a build out there, just a hunch that maybe one day I will be able to locate something, because the work of Kenji Eno deserves to be appreciated and experienced by everyone. So if there is a build for this game out in the world, I will find it and I will share it with all of you. But if we take a look at some of the magazine screenshots here and the footage, you'll see this knight in armor. And if we move back to the original D, you're going to see Laura coming down these stairs and the exact same knights appearing within both games. So again, you can see just how close the original D2 was supposed to adhere to the storyline of D, and this is an experience and game I would love to better understand and to better be able to play, because as much detail as I can give you in a video like this, there's so much of the game that we just really can't speak to because we've never seen it before. There aren't really many people out there still working in gaming that would have worked on D2, so unfortunately this is what we have, but the good thing is we do have a lot of it. Now, moving back to the cutscene again from the magazine disc, you will see here Vlad Tepes, all of his cruel deeds had been in vain and he had lost his wife, so basically he does not have an heir to his empire. That is kind of where the storyline goes, and without spoiling too much the original storyline of D, Dracula ties into that a great deal, and if you play it and find all 4 scarabs within the game, you'll understand even better how that ties in. I'll show you a little bit of footage later in this video, but if you've never played D before, I do want you to potentially experience all of those storylines and plot twists on your own, because they are very interesting, especially for the time and place. Yes, the original D is an antiquated experience by modern standards, but when this game came out in the 90s, it was an absolute hit. And if you set aside your expectations of what a video game quote unquote should be, and you play D more as a visual novel adventure game to try to soak in the story, you will genuinely appreciate it and enjoy it. Now, a lot of the footage you're seeing here, there are screenshots and different bits of detail in a World Guide to D, which I did import from Japan. So a lot of this has been translated over from Japanese to English to better get a sense of the story from those interviews as well. But you will see here Vlad Tepes is making a deal and sending a skull out into the world to try to find him an heir and son. And if that blue face does not look familiar, it should. That is basically identical to the face of Laura's father in the original D, because it seems like Laura's entire family shares a bloodline and lineage with Vlad Tepes as well as Dracula or the concept thereof. And this is from one of the 3DO magazine demo discs in Japan, but if you play D's Diner Director's Cut and collect all 4 scarabs within the game before you finish it and you get the good ending, you unlock one extra bonus cutscene that you would never see unless you play the Director's Cut, and that cutscene directly correlates into the storyline of D2 on the M2. So I'm going to let you watch it. It's only about 10 seconds, so listen for a very specific sound cue. It'll definitely inform the back half of this video. But again, the storyline is just so interesting. I love talking about it, and we're going to have a lot more right after this little cutscene. But enjoy. So in D's Diner Director's Cut on the 3DO, if you collect all 4 scarabs within your gameplay and finish the game, the last little cutscene you're going to get is going to be a black screen with a baby crying in the background. Now the second half of the cinematics for the M2 version of D2 takes place in 1998 in San Francisco, and it's going to have Laura boarding a plane, which is going to be very familiar to the introductory sequence of D2 on the Dreamcast. They kept the beginning and then completely changed everything after that. But as this plane circles around, we're going to go into the axle fuselage and the passenger compartment with Laura, and you're going to see something very different about her than in the original D. She is going to be pregnant, which almost makes you wonder if she was pregnant in the events of the original D. But this is basically the inciting incident of what would have been the storyline for D2 on the 3DO M2. Because Vlad Tepes has to get a son from somewhere, and of course if his wife died, he wants to look into the future, into his own technical bloodline. Although if his wife died, I'm really not sure from a continuity standpoint how any of these family members would be related, because there would be no bloodline, but maybe that's just a little loophole in the logic, a plot hole that was never really considered. But as her plane takes off from San Francisco, you're going to zoom directly into her face, and she's going to remember the events of the original D when she had to take on her father when she was transported from this hospital to a gothic castle in history, and that's exactly the setting that D2 on the M2 would have taken. So it seems like at least in the original D, she's been transported back to this castle as well. That little vortex seems to take people back in time to a very specific place, and she recalls having actually killed and eaten her mother and drank her blood when she was a child, which is something that is revealed in the end of the original D, and something you wouldn't really expect content and theme wise to be in a video game in the 90s. But interestingly enough, Kenji Eno hand-delivered the masters of the original D to 3DO by flying them in, because if you were late with your master delivery, you had to hand-deliver it, so he switched out the disc at the last moment so the 3DO company would print the uncensored version of D, and that's why it is so graphic for its time and place. And you will see here she even has that scarab pendant on her as she flies, and as the camera pulls away, you're going to see her holding her baby bump. This is her unborn child that was hinted at in the end cutscene of D's Diner Director's Cut, and that is how these two games tie together, and why I've always been so incredibly interested about the 3DO M2 version of D2. And thankfully, before his untimely death, Kenji Eno was gracious enough to communicate with me via email over the course of like 3 to 4 months. We were talking about what this version would have been like. I asked if there's anything left, and he basically just reiterated his time developing on the 3DO M2 and how unfortunate it was that the console was ultimately cancelled so late in the game. I'm not sure exactly how much of D2 was completed, but there's multiple demos out there in video format, and I did recover one of the last remaining files of a playable version of D2, which I will show you later on in the video. But you will see here as that lightning envelops the plane, that same blue head that made the deal with Vlad Tepes is going to come in and steal Laura's unborn baby from her womb, and this seems to be her father from the original D again, trying to give Vlad Tepes an heir so that the family bloodline can continue. And while that is a continuity and plot hole that is so big you could drive a truck through it, it does make logical sense if you just try not to think about it too much. And you will see here that fetus has been clean ripped from her stomach, she is no longer pregnant, and then this entire plane is going to crash. So the question is, does Laura actually die in the intro to D2 or not? I have multiple theories whether or not she was transported back in time, because there do exist a few screenshots in magazines of a pre-rendered Laura that was supposed to be involved in D2 somewhere. So of course I'm sure the storyline would bend and loop back on itself, and because you do have time travel, you can basically do anything you possibly could want. But as the plane crashes, go ahead and listen to the audio over the castle in Transylvania. It is very telling, and I'll be right back with a lot more D2 info. But enjoy! So now you absolutely end up understanding how Laura's unborn son ends up back in the world of D2. And just so you know, his name was going to be Taren, T-A-R-E-N. That is directly from Kenji Eno, as well as some documents from the 3DO company and some communications I've had with people. So that was supposed to be the main character of D2, Laura's son. And if you can't tell already, this was a fully 3D game compared to the point-and-click FMV original of the 3DO, but a lot of the theming, a lot of the colorways, a lot of that gothic medieval architecture is on full display here in the only remaining gameplay footage we have outside of a one quick 5-second click from the Tokyo Game Show back in the day. And this is the build that I always wonder if it may be out in the world somewhere. I have absolutely no evidence and no leads. I've tracked down so many leads that ended up being dead ends or just complete fabrications, but that doesn't mean that I don't still look for them every once in a while. I don't hunt for D2 as actively as I have before in the past because I do a lot of other hunting for other games and prototypes, but this still remains at the top of my list of experiences I would love to be able to share with absolutely everyone. Now granted, you would need 3DO M2 hardware, but I'm sure in some way, shape, or form, based upon the MAME 3DO M2 emulation for the Konami side of things, it could be worked into that, and you could end up in a situation in which it would be playable. But I did release this demo right here. This is the model that you see in the demos back in the day and on that VHS footage of Taren doing his sword strike and backflip. This was sent to me from a member of the 3DO company that worked on M2 back at the 3DO offices. There was a ton of different models, and he found this among the asset pack that he had. Unfortunately, that's all there was, but technically D2 is quote-unquote playable because you can control the camera in this demo, pause the animation, zoom in and zoom out. So if nothing else exists other than this one model doing this one canned animation from the demos that were showing in the 90s, at least something still exists. I was so happy to be able to find this and share this with all of you. And again, if I'm ever able to find anything else D2 M2 related, you know I will give it away for free in its entirety. And that's been the fun part about researching all of this. Being able to years ago talk to Kenji Eno, being able to talk to other people that worked at the 3DO company back in the day has been spectacular. Now this is the only other footage of the game that we know exists, unless you know of something, leave me a comment down below. This is from the Tokyo Game Show, and it shows Terran in a large cathedral environment jumping in front of this altar, but unfortunately wherever this footage comes from, and that source has been lost to time, this is all that is available. So it's possible that it was in just a compilation video somewhere on a disc in a magazine, and this is all they showed of D2 on M2. But we do have a few screenshots as well to collaborate what this would be, and you will see here that it is some sort of outdoor Gothic cathedral, so it seems like you wouldn't just be in Vlad Tepes' castle, you'd be moving around the grounds as well. Now if we move over to the Dreamcast version of the intro to D2, you're going to see it keeps the exact same storyline for the first minute or two. Laura is on a plane just like we saw in the M2 version, although this time she is not pregnant whatsoever, and technically in the canon of D, this is not even the same Laura as you saw in the original D. She was just a digital actress that could be employed in any storyline, as you obviously see in Enemy Zero having no relationship to D. And that is the fun part. Kenji Eno did borrow a little bit of inspiration, and the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that the original M2 version of D2's intro is playing on the airplane in the Dreamcast version on the big screen that would be at the front of the plane. Now you have this monk and Shadow the Ultimate Destroyer in the Dreamcast version of D2, and this is where the timeline completely differs. The storyline of D2 on Dreamcast has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the original D. It goes for a sci-fi element where the original was that classic horror theming, and this is where I would love to know more about the M2 version, because while I do love D2 on Dreamcast, and you will be seeing the retrospective on that next week, if I had my choice, I would have rather have had the original version as far as the theme is concerned. I'm so much more curious about how the D storyline continues in the M2 version, with Dracula, Vlad Tepes, Laura and her son traversing a 3D world versus what we got in Dreamcast. And that is not to say that the Dreamcast version isn't awesome in its own right and extremely influential. It is just so totally different than what we had on the 3DO. It really makes me wonder what we were supposed to be experiencing had the 3DO M2 actually released to retail shelves. And that's just the interesting thing about WARP and Kenji Eno's storytelling. He had a whole world built around the original D, some of it realized and some of it unrealized with the cancellation of the 3DO M2. But as that classic auteur style of directing games, you know full well that D2 on M2 would have been filled with so many nods, so many little bits of lore and details, both of which you would have noticed and some that you maybe have missed for years. Even when I played the original D, I still every year notice something about it that I've never seen before. But in this retrospective, there was no way I wasn't going to talk about the 3DO M2 version of this game. This is everything I know about it up till this point in time, and unless I find more information or a playable build out there, this may be the culmination of the information that is out there in the world for the 3DO M2 version of D2. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the retrospective. I'll be back next week with the final part, D2 on Dreamcast, but otherwise we are done, and now you can ponder what this game would have been like had it actually released. Bye bye.